If you've lost the joy because you're too busy buying all the watercolor supplies, watching all the YouTube tutorials like movies, and comparing yourself to others and your supplies, then this video is perfect for you. In this mini-series, I wanted to help you to rediscover the joy of watercolor painting step by step and really help you remove the overwhelm, the frustration, and most importantly, the self-doubt. And the reason for the overwhelm is usually because you simply don't really have a clear path, a clear structure, a clear system, how you should approach watercolor painting. Now, there are multiple ways how you can remove the overwhelm and really gain clarity and confidence and really the joy in creating your watercolor paintings. And I'm teaching all of them inside my Roadmap to Watercolor Painting course, but I'm giving you one of the best ways how you can start removing the overwhelm from your watercolor journey, and we're starting with your watercolor supplies today. Now, if you've already painted for a while and you still feel a little bit overwhelmed, especially when it comes to your watercolor supplies, it's a good opportunity for you to look over what you have and start decluttering. I'm not talking about you need to get rid of it, but I'm talking about how can you make your process a lot more effortless, more efficient and easier so you don't feel stressed, overwhelmed, and all over the place. So let's get started. Okay, so let's start by minimizing the overwhelm when it comes to your watercolors. Now, if you're like most watercolor beginners that tend to watch all the YouTube tutorials, buy all the supplies that other artists are using, you probably have the problem now that you just don't know like which color is the best, which color should I use, which colors go together, and then you kind of start mixing all the colors that you think you need, and you just create muddy colors because you don't necessarily understand how all these colors work together. Now, if you don't have any watercolor supplies and you want to get started and really feel confident about what you're using, then check out my free guide to watercolor painting supplies. So let's talk about what colors should you pick to get started to really minimize your overwhelm. Now, first, I would suggest pick the main colors first. So main colors would be yellow, red, and blue. And between those colors, you have different versions. So you have a red, for example, that is this warm red, alarming red, a little bit more orangey, but you also have reds that are slightly more pinkish. So magenta, for example, or here, this will be a sort of a magenta color. So it's a little like a pinkish color. The point here is to pick colors that go well together, that give you a variety of options how to mix them without the overwhelm. Because if you minimize your palette too much, then I believe it's too much work, too much effort to create the color you need. So starting with 2 colors of each main color is the way to go, in my opinion. So I would suggest picking, for example, one red that is, like I said, like this warm orangey type of red that is really common in every watercolor set. If you buy a starter set, they usually have, for example, a cadmium red, and then you want to pick a color that is a pinkish red. So a pinkish red could be a magenta. Magenta is a really like a strong pinkish color, but you don't necessarily have to use this color. You can use, for example, carmine red. So this, for example, would be a slightly more pinkish red. You can see how it's a little bit less orange. So if you compare them next to each other, sometimes you also need to dilute it a little bit with water to see the difference. Okay, now we want to pick 2 blue colors. And again, you want to pick 2 different ones because then it will allow you to mix bright colors if this is what you're going for. So bright green and bright purple. And for that, you want to pick, for example, ultramarine. Ultramarine is kind of like the go-to color in almost every set. I personally like to use ultramarine Finest by Schmincke because it's less granulating than some of the ultramarine. So you don't want to go with, not necessarily, if you can avoid to start with, I wouldn't use French ultramarine because this is definitely too granulating, meaning when the paint dries on your paper, you will see parts of the pigments kind of gathered in the texture of your paper. And when you mix, for example, this color with another red to mix purple, you will see how some of the pigments kind of separate, so you don't have an even mix of purple. And again, if you want to learn more about it, check out my free guide to color mixing, where I talk about it in more detail. The other color is a coolish blue. So a coolish blue would be something that's slightly more greenish. So for example, it could be cerulean blue, it can be Prussian blue. Sometimes in your watercolor sets, you can see the difference. You can see how this next to this blue, you have one that is slightly more bluish purple, and this is a more like a frosty greenish blue. Could be even like a turquoise color. So everything that's slightly more turquoise is a cool blue. Now we also want yellow. So for example, this color, lemon yellow or Hansa yellow. So something that is really like vibrant and almost neon-like. So you can see how bright that is. So it's like a nice neon, almost acidy yellow. So very, very bright and strong. And this goes well with everything. So you can use it to create oranges. You can use it to create, greens. But you can also pick another yellow that is slightly more orangey that you can then use to mix an orange. So for example, it could be, for example, this here, this color you can see compared to this yellow, slightly more orangey, slightly more a warmish sunflower yellow. And if you swatch this here on the paper, it's slightly more orangey, just slightly in context of this color. So you don't necessarily have to have two of those, but if you already have multiple colors and you just want to minimize the overwhelm, just pick two, for example, one that is more this acidy yellow and one that's slightly warmer. Now that we have a more minimalized watercolor palette to start out with, again, this is, you don't have to worry about is it exactly this color, what is the name. Pick the colors you already have to really minimize the overwhelm, and then you can really explore them even further. Now these are some of the brushes I not use all the time, but some of that I reduced already, and I use them for several different reasons. But if you're a student of mine, you've probably seen that I basically just use one or two brushes, and they're usually the same. But what most watercolor beginners do is they pick a set of really cheap watercolor brushes that have like 10 sets, like 10 different brushes, 15 different brushes that are poor quality because they don't know if watercolors is the thing for them. But what happens is that all these brushes that are super cheap quality is they can lose bristles super easily, they don't hold water, so you really have to load up your brush with paint and water multiple times. You can never really fill a page with enough paint and water because you constantly run out of water and paint, and this really becomes frustrating, and you get streaky paint, streaky results because you can't paint quickly because everything just dries super quickly because you waste so much time going back and forth with the brush. So the next step would be we want to pick just a few brushes that we can use and get the most out of them. And again, if you don't have any watercolor supplies at all, make sure to check out my guide to watercolor supplies, where I talk about what to look out for, why is it important, what's the difference, and then you can make a really informed and confident decision about what to pick. So the link is in the description box down below. Now, if you already have watercolor supplies and you feel like, okay, I bought all the brushes that I've seen other artists are using here, again, there's no the best brush. Everyone uses their go-to brushes, and you want to use a brush that is versatile. So versatile brush is a round brush, for example, a round brush with a fine tip. So meaning if you put it into water, you will get a nice tip. So it's like a nice pointy dot. So if you go in and paint, you can either paint like a big area of paint, or if you use just the tip, you can really just draw and paint like very fine lines and dots and things like that. So it's versatile. And some round brushes don't have that. They just almost like, stay round on top, but you want to have a round brush that has a fine tip. The numbers can also vary depending on the series, the brand, and things like that. So this, for example, is mop brush, or not different names, but this is a different sizing. So here this will be a number 2. This is Princeton Neptune, and this is number 6. This is a number 8. So these are like different sizes. So you want to have one that is relatively big, but not too big. It always depends on the bigger the area you want to paint, the bigger the brush. So if you paint, for example, a relatively small areas, this like a size 2 of this mop brush works. Or for example, a size 8 or 10. Maybe if you need something for details, you can also pick a smaller brush. So this, for example, is a silver black velvet. This is a number 6, and you can see how fine it is compared. So you can have, if it's easier for you to use a smaller brush for details, you can definitely go for a smaller brush also. So have one that is slightly bigger, one is smaller. And then I also suggest getting a brush to apply just, for example, just water to your paper. And you can also start with something relatively small and then grow bigger if you start painting bigger. So you can really start with even just the size like that. That is, I swatch the colors here. And for example, choose a size, this is a 30mm size brush, to really just go over the whole paper here with just water. And you want to make sure the brush is soft, so you don't want to have some kind of scrubby brush, or a slightly bigger. So this is what, for example, could already work for relatively small paintings or bigger. So this is a 50 millimeter, so yeah, 5 centimeters wide. This is Casaneo, Da Vinci Casaneo. So you can really go over the whole page to apply water or even paint. And then you can go in with your round brush to add your, if you paint the background, for example, wet into wet. And then when it dries, you can go in with your detailed brush to add some details and things like that. So you don't necessarily have to have 10 brushes, because to start out with, you want to kind of get to know yourself better when you paint. If you have multiple brushes, like for example, if you start with this brush, you'll be like, okay, so when do I use it? Do I really need it? And then it just lies around. I would rather suggest you start with the basics. And then when you realize, wait a second, this is something I always do. Like I paint small, thin lines a lot, and they're long lines. So for example, you want to paint like long lines like that, and it's harder for you with a round brush. You can then go in and decide, okay, now I'm painting lots of boats and I need to draw lots of lines. You can definitely go in and then buy, for example, a liner brush. A liner brush has long bristles like that, and then when you use that, you can paint just like thin lines like that and long, and depending on the quality of the brush, of the bristles, you can paint lots of those lines and evenly. This is just an add-on to whatever you already have. And if you realize, wait a second, there's still something missing, I tend to paint square buildings all the time, or I need a small that is maybe just too big for the flat brush, you can also pick something, a smaller brush that is still flat, because then you can go in and paint something that is like smaller like that, and you have a fine line on top. You can also just use the side of the brush, so you don't necessarily have to use a round brush to create a square. And I can see if you just have 3 brushes, you can really get the most out of them and really learn what you need as an artist. You don't need to have 20 different brushes, because it will make you feel overwhelmed. You can still grow your collection of brushes that you use, so it's not like you have to dial in everything and pick the ones that you will use forever. Now the next step to really reducing overwhelm is to just pick 1 or 2 blocks of watercolor paper, and I would suggest already when you're starting out to pick some good quality paper. And again, it doesn't have to be something super expensive. You can start, for example, with watercolor paper by Winsor Newton. I would always encourage everyone to get 100% cotton, because 100% cotton paper will just behave so much better. It won't buckle as much, it won't make your colors look pale. The colors or whatever you paint will dry more evenly, so you don't have to fight with your paper. So for example, like I said, Winsor Newton Professional Watercolor Paper, cold pressed, 100% cotton, or Arches. This is a little bit more expensive, also 100% cotton, cold pressed. And this is my go-to paper, this one, and also my Saunders Waterford block, because I just really like how effortless it is to paint on them. I don't have to fight the paper, I don't have to worry about anything. I can scrub off paint, I can apply masking fluid, I can really express myself on this paper. I don't have to kind of feel stressed about, oh my gosh, I start painting and certain areas started drying already so quickly while I'm still working somewhere here, because everything just dries relatively even. And you will see the difference. I have a whole video about the differences between watercolor paper and why this is important, and you can really see side by side the difference. And I believe that watercolor paper is the most important tool that you want to start out with to invest. Is really like watercolor paper. This is the foundation of everything you put onto paper, because what most watercolor beginners do, and I totally understand, is they buy the cheapest paper because they're not sure maybe if watercolors is the thing for them, or they are so scared to invest in good paper because, again, they feel like they're not good enough yet, so they want to wait until they deserve, quote unquote, the paper. But what happens is that if you choose the wrong paper, in terms of just pick the really bad quality, you will feel like it's all your fault. Like everything you do, nothing works. Everything just looks streaky. Everything looks pale. The techniques won't work that you see online that other artists are trying to show you, and you just feel like completely untalented, and you start questioning your abilities and if watercolor painting is even for you, and if you have what it takes to create a nice painting. And it's just because it's about the paper. And if you see how effortless can be on good paper, then you won't even want to suffer through the other bad paper. And the other cheaper quality paper you can definitely use for swatching colors or for testing some maybe color options and color combinations. I would definitely not use it for like practicing certain techniques, because they just won't work on cheaper paper. So just pick one good paper. It can be Irish watercolor paper, Saunders, or even can just buy a huge sheet, and then you can cut it into smaller sizes, and you will see the difference. Like you don't have to fill the whole page, obviously. You can, even if you buy a block, you can divide it into squares and really paint on a small square. But just to experience that, and you will just feel so relieved and enjoy the process so much more. It won't feel so stressful if you felt stressed and overwhelmed by the whole idea of painting, because the paper will support your journey, support your painting, and support you in general in your watercolor journey. So yeah, I would highly encourage you. And if you don't know which to pick, or don't know how to get started with everything, check out the free guide to watercolor painting supplies, where I go into all the details about the differences and what to look out for, so you can pick the right supply for you. And again, just pick one. You don't have to, everything is great, it's just that you need to know what to pick, and just pick one. There's no wrong decision. It's just like one decision that you test out to see for yourself, and maybe you will totally love it and stick with it. Now, these were just a few simple ways how you can really remove the overwhelm when it comes to your watercolor painting journey. And I find it's super important to make everything as simple and clear as possible for you. And if you want to learn more about how you can really remove all the stress, the overwhelm, and all the guesswork, and finally put paint to paper this year so you can create beautiful art and beauty in the world with your own hands, then I hope you will join us inside the Paint to Paper Challenge that is starting very soon. We will not only dive deep into your watercolor supplies and how you can get the most out of them so you don't feel stressed and overwhelmed by all the choices and techniques, but we will also tap into our mind and really talk about how you can really set yourself up for success when it comes to your watercolor journey and your life. You can find a link in the description box down below. Now, in the next video, I'll share even more tips and tricks how you can remove the overwhelm and frustration when it comes to your watercolor painting journey. I will show you not only how to set up your space and really remove the overwhelm when it comes to painting and give you some ideas how you can just play with your colors and explore this medium in a super fun and calming way. Until then, make sure to watch this video right here, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.